My name is Cody Kraus, and I'm a real estate broker owner that's obsessed with everything real estate. Investing, building, selling, developing, farming, you name it. I've been doing this since I was 18 years old, and I've learned a ton through trial and error, and I've met some of the coolest people ever. This is a show where I invite these people on to talk about their experiences and mine, plus everything else real estate. Let's go. All right, well, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Everything Real Estate Show. I have a repeat guest joining me today, so a familiar face around Windsor-Essex County in the law industry, specifically applying to real estate. I have Mr. Sebastian Schmoranz with me. So for anybody who doesn't know or doesn't remember Sebastian from the last time you joined us, who is Sebastian?
Thanks for having me back on, Cody. So my name is Sebastian Schmoranz. I'm a lawyer, and I own two law offices in Windsor-Essex. We own the McGregor-Sims Law Office in Kingsville and the Golden Law Office in Harrow. Combined, both firms have been operating for well over 100 years. We offer all the typical small town neighborhood services you would expect from a law firm. So we do everything to do with real estate, everything to do with corporate commercial transactions. So starting businesses, buying and selling businesses, incorporating companies, and then everything to do with wills and estates planning. So we draft wills, we draft power of attorney documents, we manage estates. We provide advice on, large complex estates where you've got, family businesses or family farms that are being handed over from one generation to the next. And then we do some basic family law and then some basic employment law as well.
Awesome. So we talked kind of before general discussion about real estate and law, but we were at an event recently and the topic came up, maybe we should do one specifically about farms because it seems like our two offices, we come in contact a lot on a daily basis in regards to real estate transactions, but specifically it's been a lot of farms lately. So why don't we have a bit of the farm discussion and why don't we start off with selling farms? Because that seems to be the big thing right now is multi-generational farm. It might be part of an estate. It might be something that's being handled as part of a downsizing in a family's life. But it seems like we're representing a lot of sellers that are selling the family farm right now. Do you want to maybe walk us through what that would look like and what kind of questions are being asked, or maybe what questions aren't being asked but should be ahead of time so that we're not running into things later? So why don't we specifically address farmland that's being sold by a family or a corporation that the family owns and what your initial intake or conversation would look like with that family?
Absolutely. So farmland is a unique type of property in terms of, it's not like residential. It's more of a commercial property in nature. You either grow crops on it, or you have a greenhouse on it, or you raise livestock or have orchards or anything like that. In the Windsor-Essex area, primarily most of the land is used for either greenhouse development or for cash crop. And when I say stuff like cash crop, I mean things like corn and soybeans and wheat. Realistically, what you want to look at when you're selling a farm property is to get a handle on what you think the land valuations are, because I'm sure, as you can tell your listeners, Cody, the land valuations have changed drastically in Windsor-Essex in the last 10 to 20 years when it comes to agriculture.
Substantially, yeah.
And then the other thing you want to look at is HST, because you are technically selling a commercial type of land, which means, we have to charge HST on the price of the sale of that land. And then the other big concern you have is capital gains tax, because it is a income generating type of property. You grow crops and you sell those crops every year. It earns a rate of return. Plus the land, generally speaking, appreciates over time. So there are capital gains tax, questions to be asked there as well. In terms of selling, primarily what we see in this area is elderly people who have been farming the land their entire lives. So, 50, 60, 70 years, and probably inherited the land from their parents who inherited it from their parents. So you've got farmland that's been farmed by the same family for sometimes well over 150 years, is being sold on the open market because, generally speaking, farming is no longer a desirable career path for many. With, rapid industrialization at the turn of the 20th century, a lot of people moved to the cities. Farming is no longer as widely, is not an economic activity that's as widely engaged in as it was 50, 60, 70 years ago. So we find that either when mom and dad die or when mom and dad are ready to retire or can't farm the land anymore, they look to their children and their children say, well, I'm a lawyer or I'm an accountant or I'm a realtor. I don't want to farm. I don't drive a combine. So then it comes time to sell it on the open market. And that's where usually the big challenge that a lot of our clients face is A, being shocked by how much the land has increased in value, and then B, being shocked by, the tax considerations that now really need to be planned for to ensure that there isn't a giant tax bill payable to the CRA after the land sells.
Yeah, now on the note of taxes, like we'll get into who's buying farms right now, but I would assume that most farm transactions you're seeing right now are farm being sold in a personal name and the purchaser is almost always a corporate name,
Very,
assuming,
very common, yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and that's probably towards the tax thing right there. Now, one phrase that keeps coming up each time we're dealing with the disposition of a farm is the lifetime capital gains exemption. Do you want to maybe, I know you're not an accountant, but run through the basics of that and we'll, you know, uh, I guess get ahead of this conversation by saying, don't take our advice for it. We always recommend counsel of an
Yes.
accountant, but just something to take into account if you are thinking of selling the farm or you're working with a family member on that.
Yes, my caveat is I became a lawyer because I suck at math, so don't take accounting advice from me. But
Yeah.
most important thing, especially if you or your parents are looking at finally selling the family farm, is it is very important to get a good accountant involved early on in the process. The main reason being, again, because a lot of these farms have been held by the same owners for such a long period of time, there is a giant capital gain in terms of what the land was worth when they bought it or inherited it, more often than not inherited it in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and what it's worth today in 2025, 2026 when it's time to sell it, right? And the basics of capital gains, so calculating a capital gain, is always what was the thing worth when you bought it? What is the thing worth when you sell it? You subtract those two numbers. The number in between, that is your capital gain. That is the value that you will need to declare on your tax return, subject to deductions and other things. Now, what is useful to understand is that the Canada Revenue Agency grants every Canadian a lifetime capital gains exemption amount. That means that over the course of your life, when you dispose of any type of property that is subject to capital gains tax, so shares in a corporation, your farmland, investments, anything that would be capital gains taxable, you can choose to do one of two things. You can either pay the tax or you can claim the value of the tax against your lifetime capital gains exemption amount. Currently in Canada, the lifetime capital gains exemption amount is somewhere in the range of about $1.2 million, which means up to $1.2 million of capital gains.
Now, is
Can
that on one transaction or is that, well, you can
It's
bank them on?
cumulative over the course of your life, so you can dip
Okay.
into it as you go through the course of your life to use it up. Again, is available to any Canadian to use. So typically what we want to do is we want to make sure that when mom and dad sell that farm, that mom and dad are set up with an accountant who will know how to properly file a tax return that takes advantage of as much of their lifetime capital gains exemption as possible to ensure that they pocket as much of the sale proceeds as they possibly can.
Yeah. Now, not all farms are just farmland. A lot of them have primary residence on them too, right? So mom and
Yep.
dad live in the farmhouse, and because they live in the farmhouse as primary residence, even though the farm portion that produces income, that would be susceptible to capital gains, but your primary residence still would not apply.
Exactly. And sometimes people get confused about this. So sometimes mom and dad are under the assumption that, oh, because I live on the farm, the entire farm is tax exempt. And that's not the case. So the basic way of understanding it is if I sell a giant farm that has a house on it and they're not severed, it's one giant chunk of land. CRA will allow you to exempt up to 1 acre of that farm for residential purposes. So you take the price, you divide it out by the number of acres, and you figure out what 1 acre of that purchase price is worth,
With
and
the
that
house.
amount of it is
Yeah.
tax exempt. The other thing you can do too, and this is what I usually recommend when we do real estate transactions involving farms that have houses on them, is in a schedule to the agreement of purchase and sale, we put a breakdown of how we are apportioning the price as between the bare farmland, the barns and outbuildings, and the residential portion of the land. And usually CRA will accept that, assuming we didn't take 99% of the purchase price and apportion it towards the house, and say that, yeah, that portion of the price is tax exempt because it's your principal residence exemption. The rest of it is HST taxable and capital gains taxable, depending on what your write-offs and claims going to be.
So you might have a $2 million sale, but you could attribute 500,000 of that to the house.
Yeah.
So there'd be zero capital gains on that
Yep.
portion.
You could, or you could maybe even attribute 800,000, right? I mean, it's
Yep.
just a question of going out and getting an appraisal done. As long as you can show that it's reasonable to provide the breakdown of price that you have, then CRA is not going to really ask any questions about it. Now, if you sold it for 2 million and you try to claim that 1.9 million dollars of your 50-acre farm was that house, then obviously they're going to audit you and they're going to have problems with it. But
Yep.
absolutely, it's usually what we recommend. It's one of the mistakes we see green realtors making who've never dealt with farm before is they forget that it's a good idea to talk about how we're going to apportion that price as between house and farmland. And then it's always that HST that everybody forgets. And then it's always the, did you have the conversation with your clients about the capital gains tax component? Because
Yep.
sometimes they sell and they didn't even think about that before. And they don't even realize it until they're sitting in the office with me signing their closing paperwork that, oh crap, I should talk to my accountant because we just sold this capital gains taxable property.
Yeah. And so you're kind of addressing mostly cash crop, like you mentioned. So cash crop is usually grown on clay, and most of Windsor Essex County is Brookston clay. So it's not the ideal soil conditions for growing vegetables like
Yep.
tomatoes and potatoes and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
Now, if you have a 25-acre clay parcel, it's really tough to make a living farming from it. Like my dad's parents, my grandparents, they grew up, they made a living, not a really good one, but they were able to provide a living off of 25 acres of sand, farmland where they could grow apples and tomatoes
Yep.
and peppers and all that kind of stuff. But with clay, typically it's always going to be a cash crop, or maybe it's going to be picked up to build structures like greenhouses on
Yep.
or something like that. So if someone can't buy it and make a living off of 25 or 50 or even 100 acres farming it now, why are people buying it? Why have the prices gone up so substantially? And I know a lot of these are my questions, as I should be answering these as the realtor, but I guess what I'm getting at is like, who is the purchaser of farms now? Because on average, like we alluded to, it's not Joe and Susie building their family's future. They're almost coming like a complex financial instrument where we have small corps and even big funds and investment companies purchasing them too. And like I said to my dad, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, I'm like, Dad, like farms used to be cheap around here, like $2,000, $3,000 an acre. Like, what were you thinking? How come you didn't go out and buy a whole bunch of it? And he's like, well, son, they were for sale for forever and you
Yeah.
couldn't get a
And
mortgage
nobody
on
wanted
them
them. You couldn't give them away. Yeah.
and they didn't make money. And he goes, now, it's just in the last 15 years that all of a sudden people have gone, well, we need to get as much land as we can, bank it, and we'll see the appreciation. And so just to kind of put a few numbers out there, like clay farmland in Windsor, Essex, your typical value range, if it's not something that we can build a greenhouse farm on, or if it's not close to a development and has the ability to be tied into sewers and town water in the near term and all that kind of stuff, you're working with a value range of maybe $20,000 to $25,000 an acre. There's events where they're less and there's events where there's more, but that's kind of the range. And a lot of what we're doing now is it's corps that are just buying another farm to add to the portfolio and they're renting them out or sharecropping them. And just to give you kind of proportionate values, you're paying somewhere around that $20,000 an acre to get maybe $400 an acre in rent on an annual
Yep.
basis, not monthly, right? So like when we, sell rental houses, it's not common to see 0.5 to 1% of the value of the house on a monthly basis.
Mhm.
In farms, you're doing pretty good if you saw like 0.5% of the value of the farm on an annual basis.
Yep.
So like, why are people buying farms at these new values when they're not making a ton of money? And who are the buyers? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, there's really three main types of buyers of farmland. So for the smaller parcels, your 25 acre parcels is almost exclusively being purchased by people who are retiring from the city and they have the dream of having their hobby farm. So they want to build, a 8,000 square foot house and have a pole barn for their horse, or they want to drive around on a side by side and have a pond and, grow some whatever they want to grow, have a meadow. That's kind of the marketplace for that. So those people don't really care about the price because they usually, have a great deal of cash and want to build their Yellowstone fever dream. Then
Sure.
you've got like kind of the 50-acre parcels and up. It becomes a question of is it economically viable to farm from a cash crop farming perspective? Because obviously, as technology comes into farming, there is always the question of the farm needs to have a minimum surface area of farmable land for it to be worth the time and money and input costs to actually actively farm it. Why? Because if you look at a combine harvester from 1982 and you look at a combine harvester from 2026, the one from 2026 is 100 times bigger than the one from 1982. So the whole point is, if I'm a modern cash crop farmer, I can't turn my combine around on a field that's smaller than 50 acres. It's just not, it's not
That
logistically efficient for me to load that combine up, drive it out to that field, and try to actually harvest that field because of just the fact that I'm going to have to do a 62-point turn every time I try to turn the thing around,
if
right?
you can even get across the ditch to get
Exactly.
it
So
there.
that's an issue, especially in smaller areas like Windsor, Essex. Like we're not out in the prairies where you have 500-acre parcels of land. You have 25, 50, 100, maybe 200-acre parcels of land. You have sometimes up to 1,000-acre parcels of land out west where a GPS drives that combine and the guy sits in an office building and monitors all of the systems, right? So you have that question. And then you have the other two main types of buyers, which are largely greenhouses. So greenhouses either want to buy the land because it's close to the necessary utilities and road systems whereby it's profitable to put a greenhouse on it and put a packing plant on it and have a shipping bay or a shipping dock so that the stuff can be packaged and loaded on a semi, be close to a highway so that the produce can make it to market. It's got to be close to water. It's got to be close to natural gas. It's got to be close to electricity. Or you have what we're increasingly seeing, which are large hedge funds and investment funds who essentially use them as land banks. They essentially say, look, um, we need a diversified portfolio. Maybe we're a pension fund and we have a minimum spend we have to do every year. We have to buy more assets and more investments on behalf of our members every single year. And our portfolio managers come up with a risk profile of, so and so many millions of dollars need to be invested in this, and so many million in that, and so many million in that. And what's become exceedingly popular, especially as land values have crept up over the last 10 to 20 years, is that these large investment funds are realizing, oh, farmland is a great investment. Farmland's a great investment because there's no people living on it, so you don't have to deal with residential tenants. Rarely is it livestock. Livestock is much higher risk, much higher cost, much more insurance costs, much more environmental concerns. Large scale farmland is great. You find a farmer to farm it for you, and the land gets farmed and hopefully it appreciates in value X% every year. And if you're lucky, you earn enough off the farming that it covers the cost of owning the land, and or maybe you even have a slight loss every year, which is nice to use as a write-off against the income that the other investments of that hedge fund earn every year. And then you also get crop insurance, which is great too. So you kind of have a guaranteed payout one way or the other. If you have a really bad year, you get paid out through the crop insurance. And if you have a really good year, you make a little bit of money on the farming, but it allows you to have this giant asset pool of all of this farmland that essentially we know based on statistics will grow in value by X% every single year. So you have a rate of return in terms of the value of the equity in the land, which also is convenient for these hedge funds if they want to go out and borrow against something, because that gives them a ton of collateral if they want to go out and borrow money to make other investments, right? So
Yeah.
we see
And
increasingly we're dealing with sometimes I'm doing real estate transactions where it's mom and pop farmers selling to a giant hedge fund out of Toronto with Toronto legal counsel and Toronto accountants representing it.
yeah. And one thing there too is like, okay, well, if they can afford to buy it and it's a good investment, why wouldn't it be a good investment for me and you to buy it? Well, the
Yeah.
difference is they have cash,
Well,
right?
that's the thing, and it's economies of scale, and they have
Yeah.
cash and it's wasting, right? And if you're in an environment where for a period of time we had some pretty high inflation, you don't want that cash just sitting around. It's got to do something, right?
Yeah.
And so every year you got to go out and you got to spend it on something, especially if you're these large pension funds or investment funds. You have to buy stuff with it, right?
Yeah. And
Because
so even
otherwise
though they're
the money
paying,
literally goes bad, right? Due to the cost of inflation. Whereas for smaller people like you and me, I mean, if you have the cash, great. Um, if you don't have the cash, there are other interesting ways of buying farmland. There are all sorts of farming regions across Ontario. And farmland is actually in many ways expanding in some ways in Ontario because of climate change. So you have regions in northern Ontario where you probably couldn't have really gotten a crop in or off due to how long the winters were and how brutally cold it was because of the general warming of the climate. you now end up with land where you can actually, grow wheat and alfalfa, which are pretty hardy crops, where you can get maybe even 1 to 2 crops off per year. And that land is still extremely affordable because it's so remote, right? So
Yeah.
those are other fun things where maybe you monitor tax auctions and you pick up a 250-acre parcel of land for really cheap because some guy went bankrupt and died and didn't pay his property taxes, right? And so you can scoop it up for not that much money. And it's kind of a neat investment to have because if you can get into it for not too much, it will earn you a little bit, or it at least will cover the cost of itself. And you can kind of sit back on it and wait and watch it appreciate in value and determine if maybe one day you do want to sell it as it, grows in value.
Yeah. And so like I'm thinking, okay, $20,000 an acre. And at the really, really high end, I know some people were getting $500 an acre for rent. So that's like a return of 2.5%. And so the way these hedge funds are like the big one around here seems to be the teacher's pension fund.
Yeah.
They're buying a lot of farmland. And so they would look at it and go, okay, well, I can buy that 100 acres for $2 million. And on that $2 million, we'll get, 2.5% on our money. So that's going to cover the inflation side of it
Yeah,
and the
pretty much.
holding costs because there's
So we're
almost
going to
no.
park it and we're going to wait and we're going to watch it appreciate in value. Or at some point in the future, maybe we use it to borrow against to go make some more speculative investments where we don't really
Yeah.
want to use our own cash, where we'd rather borrow because
And
you have all the equity in the land.
the taxes are almost nothing on
Yeah,
vacant farmland, right?
absolutely.
Your input costs are zero if you're
Yeah.
renting.
Frequently you get write-offs against it because again it barely breaks even, so usually you have a little bit of a loss, which again depending on what your tax picture looks like and your asset picture looks like, if you're one of these big funds, might be nice. You have this really safe boring asset that will gradually appreciate over time, that every couple of years posts a bit of a loss, which you can use to offset against your other income and say, I mean, I'm not making $1 bajillion, but it's not risky either. I know for sure where it is and it's always going to be there and it's always going to earn roughly this. And in 100 years, because these funds think in 100-year, 50-year time cycles, they don't think like we're going to sell it tomorrow.
Yeah.
It'll have doubled, tripled in value, and we sell it then.
Yeah, and maybe 1 out of 10 or 20 or 30, they get lucky and it happens to be near enough an urban area or
Yeah,
a new sewage plant, and all of a sudden it could actually be future
development land.
development
Yeah,
or whatever. And then all of a sudden your price per acre doesn't really
yeah,
apply anymore from a
and
farmland
that's
perspective.
and that's where you look at land speculation. So that's the other type of
Yeah.
people who buy farmland. I mean, the most famous one in Ontario is Farhi. You see it on you see it up and down the 401,
Yep.
all over Windsor, all over London, all over Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge. The Farhi family very smartly over the last 60, 70 years has pretty much bought up as much of the farmland along the 401 corridor as they possibly can. So the 401 corridor very frequently gets redeveloped for rest stations or for industrial or for commercial land. And you sit on it and you wait. In the meantime, somebody farms it for you. And again, it earns you your 2 to 2.5% a year. So you're not losing money on it. And eventually, a municipality comes along and passes a bylaw that expands the development area to encompass part of this land that you own. And now suddenly your land triples, doubles, quintuples, 10x's in value. And now you own development land that you can then turn around and sell. Or
Beverly
if you have the
Hillbillies.
cash, you develop it yourself, right?
Yeah, Beverly Hillbillies is what I think
But
about.
that's the
You
Beverly
struck the
Hillbillies joke.
oil.
It's very,
Yeah.
very common, and that's the other gamble. So the other gamble you can do, and I have a client up near in Bruce County, is the same thing. Is family owned farmland for decades and decades and decades and decades and decades and decades, and the whole point was to speculate. And eventually, with the Bruce nuclear power plant, additional development land was needed by the municipality, and 50, 60 years after they bought most of it, there was suddenly the opportunity to sell some of it at a very sizable profit. Because again, it only becomes valuable once the municipality says you can build on it. And then poof, now it's been converted from soybeans to, a shopping mall or a school or a residential subdivision, right?
Yeah. And I think of, okay, so 2.5% if I pay cash for it, but then for you or me to go put a mortgage on it, it's going to be, somewhere from 60 to 70% mortgaged.
Yeah.
So you got to come up with that big down payment, but then you're servicing debt at a cost
Yeah.
of probably around 5 or 6%.
It only
Um,
makes sense if you have lots of other assets and you're like, yeah, this is something to add to my portfolio. Or if you do actually actively farm it, like if you are into farming, in which case,
yeah.
by all means, buy as much of it as you can. But the only other one that's kind of unique to Windsor Essex, although you see it in Chatham, Kent as well, is the smaller parcels in particular, depending on where they're located, can be particularly valued when it comes to energy generation, so power generation. So if you look at windmills or solar panels or natural gas cogeneration facilities or battery storage facilities, I do very frequently down here see opportunities where either Enbridge or Hydro One or other utilities show up and say,
Brookfield. Yeah.
"Yep, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Farmer, you got a really awkwardly triangular shaped piece of 12 acres of land that really who the heck wants to farm? Could we take half of it and put a battery storage facility on it? We're going to pay you a stupid amount of rent every year, and we're going to cover all the costs to maintain it. You just got to give us access to the land." And it's a really great windfall for some of these people. And they always very kindly offer to pay the legal fees for the people who they make these deals with. So I love them too because I get paid well. But it is lovely. It is really interesting because the way the Ontario government regulates power generation and the way they view what the power generation needs of the next 100 years is going to be is they want multiple small decentralized privately owned power generation nodules all over Ontario that can dump into the grid whenever needed. Because what they realized is the capital expenditure to build something like a nuclear power plant or a hydroelectric dam is astronomical and it takes forever. And then once that thing is built, because of how logistically expensive and complex it is to run it, that facility then needs to run 7 days a week, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day to even make any economic sense whatsoever. And
Yep.
so their realization is it makes much more sense to allow people to do smaller solar projects or wind generation projects or small natural gas power generating projects, or eventually what they're talking about is smaller like modular reactors that are like a nuclear reactor that'd be the size of like a typical 2-bedroom home kind of thing that you could plop wherever you wanted to, because the overhead cost of building it, the sunk capital cost of building it is way lower. And because it costs so little to build and so little to run, it's easy for the grid to turn it on and off as needed. So if you have a day where you have too much power, you can turn that thing off. It doesn't have to be running, and there's no giant cost losses by turning it off and then turning it back on again, right?
Yeah. Plus,
So,
you don't have like 100 full-time staff operating
yep,
it.
you
They're
don't have an
usually not
army
even
of people
staffed.
maintaining it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Now, these farms that have these leases on them, it's interesting. So these companies will go out and they'll sign thousands of leases, but they don't necessarily exercise all of them too.
Yep.
Like we saw just what you were talking about. We see it all the time where we go to sell a vacant parcel of land and then all of a sudden you find out after the fact that there's a wind lease on it. And we're going,
Yep.
well, where's the
Where's the
windmill?
windmill? Yeah,
They've been
exactly.
paying leases for 15
Yep.
years, but they never exercised the right to put it up. Now,
Yep.
there can be some long-lasting effects that come with that agreement that you signed too. So what are some things that
Yep.
people might want to look for in one of those contracts? Because they sound very lucrative, right?
Yep.
First glance, it's always like, oh, well, my land's only making me, $14,000 this year, but I could have a windmill that could maybe make me 15. So I could like double
Double my
the
money.
income
Yeah.
from this land. Why wouldn't I do that? And so the one thing I'll say that we see a lot, and I'll let you finish it because you see it even more so, is they'll start off with a lease to just it's an option to install the
Yep.
windmill or the solar panels, and we're going to pay you X number of dollars per year until we decide to exercise that option. And if we do, we'll either pay you this much more or you'll actually get a percentage of the production
Yep.
as a payout back to that. And we see that with oil around here quite a bit too. But what are the potential side effects where if I commit to one of those long-term leases that it could have on my parcel?
Yeah. So the main thing you want to look at is typically what happens is the people who are involved in these power generation projects, they want to tie up as many different parcels of land as they possibly can based on where they think they could put a solar panel or a windmill or a battery storage facility or a cogeneration plant. Because why? Because a lot of this, they have to bid on these projects with the provincial regulator for these types of projects, which is the IESO, and they put in 100 bids every year, and they don't know how many bids they're going to win. But they got to make sure they have enough land available in the event that they win all their bids, because once they win the bids, then they got to start building, right? So what they do is they'll go out and they'll usually have landowners sign an option agreement that option agreement is either for 1 year or 18 months or 2, 3, 4 years. And essentially just says that, hey, we would love to have the option to, at some point in the future, build this type of thing on your land. They usually will attach a drawing that shows where on the land they would want to put it. And in that agreement, it usually says, to grant, because you're granting us the option to be able to do this at a future date, we are going to pay you an annual option fee of insert dollar value here. And then it's going to say, and in the event that we exercise our option, then we will immediately enter either into a lease or we'll buy the land from you. And that usually gets attached as a schedule, and that's usually negotiated to some extent in advance. So every year landowner gets his little option payment, and that's great. And at some point you might get a letter from the power company that says, hey, green light, we're going to go ahead and build the thing on your land now. So now we'd like to convert this over into an actual lease agreement. And then usually they sign 20, 30, 40, 50-year leases with lots of renewal, extension terms that set out how much they're going to pay in rent and what their obligations are, insurance, all that other fun stuff. Now, problem with it is sometimes they register them on title. Frequently they register them on title. Sometimes they don't if they're lazy, but almost always they do. Obviously, the concern is it does, to some extent, restrict what you can now do with your land. So a potential buyer needs to be aware of that if they are buying the land and they have plans to do all sorts of stuff with the land. If most of it is subject to an option agreement, then they've got to know that there's really nothing, if they wanted to build a barn there or put any other type of permanent structure there, that's not going to be permitted pursuant to the option agreement, because that land needs to be kept unchanged until such time as the option expires or they decide they're going to exercise the option. Now, almost always with farmland in the option agreement, it says you may continue to farm the land, because obviously that would be stupid. So at a minimum, you can still farm the land that's there. Now, you have to understand, though, when they do exercise that option, they may take several years to build on that land, which means there will probably be some disruption to your usage of the land and your ability to farm that land while they excavate out the site and figure all those other things out. So that can sometimes impact how you do things. Now, the other thing, the other distinction you want to think of is, are you the one that wants to own the project and apply for the project, or are you just leasing space on your land to someone else who is going to apply for and own that project? And in my experience, it's always better to do the second option. We run into this a lot with residential as well. So when you have houses that have solar panels on the roof, there were two main ways in which you end up with solar panels on your roof. Either you apply to the IESO and you get your microfit license and you pay for the solar panels and you put them on your roof and you connect them to the grid and you get a check every month from Hydro One or from whatever the local utility is that says, here's how much power you made. Or a company comes along and says, hi, Mr. and Mrs. Homeowner, I want to rent X number of square feet of your roof to put solar panels on. I own the solar panels. I'm responsible for the solar panels. I pay you rent based on how much roof I get. I always suggest option B is better. Option B is better because it's way easier and there's way fewer strings attached from the perspective of the owner of the property. It also makes it way easier to sell the property. Reason being, if you own a microfit, so if you own the license with the IESO for the thing that's on the roof of your house, or you own the license with the IESO for the solar panel that's on your farm or the windmill that's on your farm, if you sell it, you have to deal with the IESO to transfer that license to the new owner of the property, which can be a nightmare and take forever. If you just have a lease agreement, XYZ Energy Company leased X number of acres of land for me to put a windmill on it. Great. When you sell the farm, you send that lease to the new buyer and you do an assignment and it gets assigned over to the new person and nothing else changes. And that I always find is a much cleaner, easier way of doing it, because transferring the licenses for these power generating things can take years. And it means that for years, the check for the power keeps going to the former owner. And so now we always got to true that up at the end of every month. And it just becomes very annoying. It's much easier if you're in a situation where it's just a lease, because you get a check, it's not your problem. It's your tenant. You assign the tenant on to the next buyer. If you sell it, it's not your problem.
Well, and so on the farm side of that, I mean, if the panels break, it's up to the company to come and fix the
Yep.
panels. You don't have to do the maintenance side of it.
Yep.
I'll disagree on the residential side of it, just because we've seen it where it's like, okay, well, a lot of shingles don't last as long as solar panels last, right?
Yep.
So now all of a sudden, I got this house with a 10-year-old roof and a 1-year-old solar panel, and I didn't put on a good shingle. Well, who's going to be responsible for removing those and then putting them back on when
For
it's time
sure.
to redo my shingles. And then the other thing is if the future owner doesn't like the look of them, if they owned them, they might be able to at least cope with the fact that
Yep.
usually they're 15 or 20-year leases. And then
For
at the
sure.
end of the 20-year agreement, or sorry, even the power generation agreement, 10 or 20 years. And at the end of
Yep.
that, now you own the panels and you can go into a net metering system so you can
Yep.
actually sell the power back to the grid.
For
But then all of
sure.
a sudden, say I want to go buy your house and you leased out your roof for 20 years and I don't like the look of them, that could actually be a hindrance on the
For sure.
disposition.
It's I,
Whereas,
it depends. So I agree, especially with the residential thing.
yeah,
You really have to do your due diligence in terms of which company is going to be the one that's
big
leasing the
time.
space on your roof, because there are some very crappy tenants in that world, and there are some really good ones. So absolutely, it can be very annoying to deal with. My main concern is trying to transfer the ownership of those things over can be very
Oh, I
annoying.
believe that.
Now,
Yeah.
if you don't plan on moving, if you're like, no, no, this is my dream. I want to have this super green house where I have these really cool solar panels and I'm not moving, then absolutely do it yourself. But if you're like, this is a stepping stone house for me, and this company showed up and said, hey, you want to do this? And you're like, I'm probably selling this house in the next couple of years anyway. I don't care. To me, leasing is easier.
It's kind of like a rented wa hot water tank.
Yeah.
Over the short term, you might come to peace with it. Over the
Yeah.
long term, you're not going
It
to
can
love it.
get annoying. Yeah, it's like a steel roof. Are you going to put a steel roof on your starter home? No, but you're probably going to put it on your forever home, right? It's just one of
Yeah.
those, how much of a commitment do I want to make situations?
Yeah. Now, one thing I've seen with the wind leases on a farm is it can actually affect the structures that you build on it moving forward because they kind of, in a sense, also lease the airspace over top of
Yeah.
the farm, right?
So there is, so you run into issues with both if you end up with an easement for just hydro lines, or if you end up with a windmill. They will have very specified wording as to the airspace above the land that they're leasing and how close other structures can be to that and how tall those structures are allowed to be. So that is again something where, especially with windmills, windmills are pretty, it's a pretty substantial thing you're putting on your land. Like there's also, they have to get clearance from local airports. There's all sorts of stuff that needs to happen.
Yeah.
Those really are ones where you really want to make sure you fully understand what you're getting yourself into. Because yes, there are definitely, restrictions on what can be done around the land because of how high up into the sky that large spinning object goes.
Yeah. And then you can't really just like own a farm and then decide one day I want a windmill either, right? It is
Yep.
dependent on what the political flavor of the month
Oh
is
yeah.
at that point too. Like right now, they're not exactly going around and signing a whole bunch of new oil contracts.
Yep.
The windmills were really, really big 15, 20 years ago. We're not
Yep.
seeing a big investment into that right now. Solar, I mean, the big one that we've seen around here because of the greenhouses that we touched on too, the amount of need for huge gas lines and hydro lines to get the power to all the greenhouses around here.
Yep.
We're seeing a lot of that. One thing maybe we didn't talk about too is there's one type of property that gets expropriated more than any other type of property, and that would be farmland also. Do you want to maybe touch
Yep.
on that? Because that's something that's
Well,
happening around here quite a bit too.
farmland's out in the middle of nowhere and there's no people on it. And from the perspective of either the county, the province, the feds, or the municipality, usually that's a good place to put roads and run utilities and run hydro lines and run all sorts of stuff or expand highways. And so, yes, very frequently, because it's much easier to do than trying to run a high tension wire through the middle of a residential neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
So, the fact of the matter is, yes, very frequently, if you are the owner of a farm, you will every now and again get a letter from either the province or from the municipality or from a large, public utility that says, hey, I got to run a power line somewhere. And I feel like running it across your farm would make a heck of a lot of sense. And then there's many ways of doing it. Either they will take the land, so either they expropriate it or they buy it from you. So there's a negotiation involved in terms of how much are we selling it to you for. Or it's we just need an easement. We want to bury a line or we want to run an above ground line and we just need 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet of access to run the thing along. And we promise to maintain it and we promise to insure it and all that other fun stuff, but we do need it. And would you sell it to us? And, here's what we'd like to offer you. The expropriation process, a lot of people freak out about expropriations. Expropriation process in Ontario is actually very easy and it's very fair. I mean, the legislation makes it clear that the expropriating authority must pay you fair market value for the land. They can't pay you less than what the fair market value is. So it's just a question of saying, okay, well, let's go out and get an appraisal. And, if we don't like the appraisal from the municipality, then we go out and get our own appraisal. And usually, reasonably speaking, you can negotiate something with that municipality and say, all right, this is, what you're gonna pay me to get it. There's really not much you can do to stop them from taking
I
it.
say, but you can't say no,
Yeah,
right?
and so this is again where people get confused between the American system and the Canadian system. So what everybody needs to understand is that Canada is a constitutional monarchy, which is why we still have a governor general. So technically we have a king. We have King Charles. He is our king. So the law says that all of the land in Canada devolves directly from the crown, which means at the end of the day, King Charles could, if he wanted to, show up in your living room and take your property back if he so felt like it. Now, because we are a constitutional democracy that has a constitution, the government is required to pay you for your land when they come and take it. So, will they pay you? Yes. Can you tell them, no, don't take it? No, you can't. They will take it. There's no way around it. Now, can you negotiate how much they take and what it looks like and how much they're going to pay you for and other perks that you might get out of it? Absolutely. So, not from the expropriation side of things, from the purchasing and easement side of things, Hydro One and Enbridge are notoriously nice to deal with. And I very frequently run into situations where they're like, hey, I need the 20 feet off the front of your property because we got to run a line and we know it's going to suck and we're going to make a giant mess. Here's what we're going to pay you. We're also going to pay your legal fees. And frequently I see them and they say, oh, we also have a landscaping budget. So, like, you want some more trees or some more shrubs somewhere, or you want some fresh sod, or like, what can we do? And I've literally seen people, like, we've negotiated some great deals where they were like, they had to put a transformer box, like a giant one, like on the corner of my property, and it hums and it's loud as shit. But you know what? They put 4 rows of cedars around it and they resodded the whole thing, and it looks better than it did before they came, right? So it's all just a question of a negotiation. But with a municipality, expropriation is something you cannot get around. It's just a question of agreeing on what is a fair market value for what it is that they're taking. And it's just a negotiation. You don't have to go to court for it. I mean, there is a mechanism that you can challenge an expropriation through the planning tribunal in Ontario, but there really is no point because at the end of it,
You're
the
not going to
tribunal
win.
is still going to say they can take it. All they can
Yeah.
argue about is process. Did they give us proper notice? Could they have taken a different piece of property? Could what they're taking be less? Can they still get the same outcome? And do we agree on what the price is? So I always tell people, like, as much as I would love you to pay me lots of money to fight stuff, don't go and hire a lawyer to fight an expropriation. You can hire a lawyer to help negotiate what your price is.
Yeah.
There's really no point in fighting it.
Is there instances where they may offer to give you another parcel, like
Yep.
a land swap? And then
Yep.
on that note too, um, it's pretty common practice now. So like there's an urban development area inside of each municipality, and a developer might come to you if you're the farm owner and say, "Hey, you're outside of that, but you're more likely to be developed than this other parcel that I own over here.
Yep.
So I'd like to buy your parcel, and then what I'll do is I'll talk to the town and I'll tell them I'll allow the urban
Yeah.
expansion area essentially to be taken away from mine and substituted over to yours. So
Yeah.
the town's not going to grow at 100 acres this year.
Yeah.
It's going to grow at the planned 50. We're just going to
Yeah.
redesignate the rights that were on my
Yeah.
50 to your 50, and I'll buy your 50 too, right? So like
It
there's
is.
some,
It's another one of the great reasons why, even on a small scale, holding farmland to speculate can be very useful if you're a developer or a farmer. Because
yeah,
if you get an inkling on which direction the town's growing, or which is another thing too, it's not always about residential development. It can be stuff like, well, we need new drainage ponds. We need a new water treatment plant. We need a
we need
new,
new industrial area.
yeah. So it doesn't always have to be, a sexy subdivision. It can be, oh, well, there's a new water treatment plant and we need new ponds. And we need at least 100 acres to put that whole system on.
Of one
And
parcel.
you happen to own it. And you're like, great, well, fantastic. And
Yeah.
those are all the other, because again, big open flat land, which typically is what farmland is great for all sorts of things. Now, the big challenge you always have to overcome in Ontario is the Planning Act. And the Planning Act has a special place in its heart for agricultural land, because at the end of the day, we need that to live, right? So agricultural land tends to be the highest value land, aside from environmental stuff, for protection. So you have to, generally speaking, jump through far more hoops to rezone agricultural land into any other type of development land than any other type of land that exists in Ontario. Why? Because we're not making any more farmland. Farmland is important for feeding people. We don't want to unnecessarily convert its use if that can be avoided. But
Yeah.
again, the expansion of an economic development area of a municipality, utility projects, road systems, all of those types of things are the common triggering events that will allow that kind of land to be rezoned.
What's the survey or the study called where they check for like indigenous artifacts and
Yes, the archaeological surveys. Yeah, so that's another
archaeological
one you have to be
surveys?
careful about because
Yeah.
especially big flat land, like what did your great grandfather do? They didn't have garbage and recycling. They just dumped everything on the farm, right? And then tilled it over every year. So it's now 100 meters below the surface of the earth. So you can find all sorts of stuff. And then you also have to look at environmental studies. Are there any types of plant life or animal life or insect life that calls that land home? And those are
Snakes and
yeah,
turtles and
and those are
yeah.
all things that need to be taken into account when you're looking to redevelop that type of land. Like, for example, you'll know in most cash cropping operations to avoid erosion, you usually have a fence row that runs down the edges of your farm. The fence row usually has trees and bushes and shrubs in it. Very commonly, that's where the plants and animals live. So, a big problem of when you try to go to redevelop that land is when the conservation authority comes out or the ministry of environment comes out and does their studies, they very frequently will find all sorts of ecosystems living in those fence rows, right?
Yeah.
And those are the kinds of things that are part of the deciding of, are we going to redevelop it or are we not going to redevelop it?
So on the note, here's a really small subject for you. You probably listened to the podcast I sent you last week. Uh, it was on the note of our monarchy that we live under.
Yes.
You're probably following what's happening,
Yes,
what's going on
Indigenous title. Indigenous title
in
is
Richmond,
fascinating.
BC. So
Yes.
we don't have a ton of time left in this podcast, but do you want to briefly touch on what has happened in BC with Indigenous non-treaty land, and then could we even run into that potentially in Ontario?
Well, so the issue you have, well, it's not an issue, but our Constitution ensures that the rights of First Nations, Aboriginal peoples, Indigenous peoples are to be protected and considered in all actions of the federal and provincial governments.
Yeah.
Because obviously we owe a duty of care to them because of the fact that it was historically their land. So you have two main types, and I'm not an expert on this. You can get an Indigenous lawyer on as an expert on this. But generally speaking, you have two main types of Indigenous land claims. You have treaty-based claims where they can say, yeah, in 1600 something, a representative of the British government said that we own this land, and then they lied to us and didn't give us the land. And so that fights its way through the court system, and using evidence and proof and stories and documentation, eventually you prove like, no, in fact, we did sign a contract to own this land and you got to give it back to us. That's the one type. And then the other type is, either unceded lands where a band council can show we actually never gave this land over to the crown. So technically it still belongs to us several hundred years later. Or where there was, unwritten agreements that suggest that, historically speaking, our clan had a claim to this land, right? And so the issue becomes, especially when you're doing large infrastructure projects, is can the federal government force these projects through if there are Indigenous communities that have claims one way or another to these lands? And that continually becomes the sticking point, because then the other issue you run into is a lot of pretty much every different type of First Nation has its own governance structure because they were all different cultures. So they all had different ways of making rules about how their communities interact with one another. So some of them have appointed or elected councils. Some of them have hereditary councils. So you're born into this. And some of them have a blend. So then you have the biggest problem of, well, the province or the federal government might sign a deal with the elected band council, but then it turns out that there are these hereditary members of this band who also have decision-making authority, who don't agree with what's happening. And then technically, because they have this constitutional protection, the court needs to take that into consideration when determining, do we have a binding agreement to do this project, or do we not have a binding agreement to do this project? And so you have people who are private property advocates saying, well, how can any of this be fair? Because there's no consistency in decisions in terms of who owns the land and who doesn't own the land and who's allowed to make decisions about it. And then you
Yeah.
have the people on the other side saying it's supposed to be messy because these are all individual little nation states within the giant country of Canada, and they were around for hundreds and hundreds of years before we ever showed up. And this is how they make decisions about land ownership. So we have to respect that. So it's going to become really interesting, especially as we see the federal government under Carney is trying to do these large natural gas and oil pipeline projects. How do you run these pipelines through land where there are these various Indigenous claims against? And how do we square that, right, with the fact that the federal government should be able to do these projects, but that we have a constitution that protects the fact that these people may have claims to these lands? So it's going to be, it's one of the most rapidly growing areas of law. It's not just getting groups of Indigenous people together to be recognized by the federal government as a distinct nation, like the Caldwells. It's also figuring out who owns what and what does the federal government need to get permission for to do stuff with land that these groups have claims against. And that is going to be years and years and years and decades of decisions from the various, courts of appeal and federal courts about, how are we going to live together with these types of land deals. And then BC is particularly complicated for that because BC, and don't quote me on this, but I think BC has the largest and most diverse number of different First Nations out of all of Canada. I think BC, I could be wrong, but I think BC has more individual tribes than anywhere else in Canada.
I believe that. Just look at the names of all the cities out
Well,
there.
that's the
That
thing.
don't, yeah.
It's fascinating from a historical perspective, but it also makes it extra complicated because it's literally like if you looked at Essex County, imagine if let's go back before amalgamation. Imagine if every little hick town that used to exist, Gosfield North, Gosfield South, Union, all the little. Imagine if each of them was their own completely independent government and the federal government had to build the 401 through Essex County. It would be years and years and years and years of negotiating with
It
each
wouldn't happen.
individual little clans to be like, yeah, but no, but it can't go here, but it should go here. But you didn't ask the right people. Well, you didn't get the right approval. Well, you didn't pay us enough. Well, and so it's a very complicated thing because you're trying to apply Western law to Indigenous traditional cultures, customs, oral histories, their own legal systems, their own systems of government. And sometimes they just don't overlap at all. And sometimes they do. And then sometimes it's just a case of figuring out how to come up with a compromise that everyone can live with. And what makes Canada unique, unlike the US, is when Trudeau Sr. was involved in making our Constitution, we looked at what the Americans had done in their Constitution in 1776 and said, we want to ensure that we protect minority rights. So you've got language rights protected, you have religious rights protected, and you have Indigenous rights protected. And unlike the US, we have this magical system where the Supreme Court can make rulings about whether or not the federal government was correct in how they went about doing stuff, which is why any private citizen can bring a challenge against the federal government to the Supreme Court of Canada if they feel like they violated the Constitution, which is what these Indigenous groups are doing. So it's particularly in BC, it is going to be, Quebec also very much so, is going to be a very interesting and complex series of decisions that are going to iron out the law of how do we actually do these things.
Yeah, and the electronic land title system wasn't the greatest in the 1600s, right? They
No,
did.
and that's the thing. And here's the other crazy thing about BC. BC is largely coastal. So the land, so if you try to describe where a shoreline was in 1600 something with erosion, that might not make any sense at all today. So you have no idea when they were trying to describe, oh, between this rock and this giant tree, this many paces in this direction. Well, that might all be the ocean now. Or it
Yeah.
might be the shoreline went 200 meters the other direction, right? And so trying to cobble together these ancient writings about what were we describing when we were trying to describe this land is a nightmare. Like, I mean, I already deal with it just from regular real estate law in Windsor, Essex, when you end up with a really old parcel where everything was described in chains, right? And chains is
66 by
literally like,
132.
the surveyor showed up and put his cigarette out and put a giant pole in, and he describes where that pole is in words, which makes no sense because there's no GPS. So you're like going, well, it was 16 feet, this many issues away from the red barn. And you're like, well, I hope that red barn's still there. And then it's like, and then this many chains this way, and this many chains this way, and this many chains this way. And that's only in the last 100 years. Now imagine you go 3, 4, 500 years back, and you're trying to understand like what some French or British expeditionary government official was trying to describe in this treaty when him and these tribal members sat down and said, well, what's yours and what's mine, and let's try and describe this in writing. And by the way, half the tribal members spoke a completely different language, so you're trying to figure out, did we even understand what we were agreeing to when we signed it? And so it's, from a historical perspective, super fascinating, because the history of law on that front is wild, because it really is.
Fascinating, but
Yeah.
implicating,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Because it makes it very difficult from a modern era when you're saying, well, we need some predictability in how things happen. And the only thing that's predictable about this is that nothing is predictable about this. And
Yeah.
that's the challenge with these Aboriginal land claims is, well, they're not wrong, but now we got to unravel this mystery. And there's many different ways of interpreting, what they tried to agree to in these treaties.
And no one's alive from it.
Well, yeah,
And
no. Yeah.
so then I wonder, well, are the feds just going to step in here along with our monarchy and say,
Yeah.
guys, we need to put an end to this at
Yeah.
a
Well, I mean,
federal.
that's the thing. We do have that ability in our Constitution, right? We have the notwithstanding clause. So the federal government could expropriate a bunch of land in the national interest of building a pipeline, and they could say, and even if the Supreme Court of Canada said you didn't properly consult with First Nations, they would have the ability to invoke the notwithstanding clause and say, well, we're going to do it anyway. Right now, the notwithstanding clause comes up for review every so and so many years, and it's a big political hand grenade.
Yeah.
So if you do that, all the opposition parties in Parliament would be stupid if they didn't jump all over that, right? So historically speaking, the federal government has always been very wary about invoking the notwithstanding clause when they're trying to ram something through, because they know it's political suicide.
Carney might have a unique window to do that now, though, because he would have most of the conservative support
Yep.
if he were to do that for the
Yep.
purpose of oil.
I think what you're going to see is assuming the Trump mania doesn't start really poisoning Canadian politics. I think you have a lot of national unity right now that says we can't rely on the US, and we have to make some really big decisions about infrastructure projects that will allow us to trade with the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And I think for the first time ever, you have a lot of broad-based support, even among Green Party members, even among NDP members, that say, we got to make some big decisions that are going to impact us for the next 100 years, in the next couple of years, because this is our window of opportunity to do it, which is why a part of me thinks like Carney may only be a 1 or 2 term prime minister, because he's going to do a bunch of really big stuff and everyone's going to support him doing it. And then it's going to be political suicide. And then he's going to graciously walk away again and say, well, I got it all done. Nobody liked it. Somebody had to do it, but now it's done. And now the system's set up. And now it's always the joke about the GST, right? Is, everybody ran against the GST, and then the GST came in, and then the federal government,
nobody got rid of it.
Money they made off the GST, and yeah, we complained about it, and then there's no leading political party in Canada that says we're going to get rid of the GST, because they're like, it's free money. We'd be stupid to get rid of it, right?
Yeah. So
that's kind of the
as much as one party might not like another party's politics, they all dislike the hate that we're getting from.
They dislike the fact that we're trapped, and I think that's the problem. Is the first time we've realized, like, oh, if our neighbor to the south makes a series of really bad decisions, there's nothing we can do about it.
Our hands are tied.
That is, I think, the one thing that everyone in Canada, broadly speaking, seems to have woken up to say, oh, well, let's get some stuff done so that at least if this ever happens again, it's not the end of the world.
Well, I'm interested to see how this plays out, especially because like the biggest case of this coming up right now is in Richmond, BC, which is like there's an actual city built on it. Yeah. And so now people are wondering, can I even sell my house?
Yeah. Is this like a cloud on title now? Is this like I can sell it to you now, but I don't know what's going to happen in the next 2 to 20 years. Maybe it's not going to be mine anymore, right?
That's why I think the feds are going to have to step in for that and for the oil pipeline.
Yeah, I think the feds are going to probably have to pass some laws that say certain areas of land have to be completely free of these claims.
Yeah.
And that just is what it is. And here's a large pile of money. We're very sorry that we're doing it, but we have to take it because there has to be certainty of who owns what and that there aren't these clouds on title.
Or maybe we'll give you 2,000 acres of crown land to make up for
Yeah,
your
and
1,000
say,
acres
you know what I
of.
mean? But yeah, it's I think it's going to be very much, and I think it'll probably go to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada is going to have to make some sort of a decision about when, like, how broad can these claims be, and are there any mechanisms by which we can restrict them somewhat? And I think
Oh,
that's going to be,
how do we
interesting.
measure their legitimacy?
Yeah,
Like,
but even if they are legitimate, how do we deal with the fact that, like, but yes, all of this time has passed and now there is a city there.
yeah,
So what are we going to do? Right. So we have to come up with a mechanism of how we solve that problem. It can't just be, well, it just works its way through the court system and everything stays in limbo for 30, 40 years. It has to be like, okay, well, then let's come up with a system whereby we resolve these. And we all agree that these are the rules of how we resolve them. Right. And I think
yeah.
that's probably what's going to come out of it, because otherwise it can't just float around forever.
What's the term for like an expiry of a period of time?
Yeah, it's like a limitation period, right? And it's
Yeah.
it's looking at it and saying, like, maybe there is a limitation period on it, or
Statute
maybe
of
we're,
limitations. Yeah.
or maybe it's like I said, we have to come up with some sort of like conflict resolution system that's going to say, fair, we acknowledge your claim, the claim's legitimate, but there's a city here now.
It's been here for 50
I
years.
can't
Yeah.
dispossess 500,000 people of the city. It's there. So now what do we do to make it right? Right?
Yeah.
And I think that's sometimes, it is definitely in civil law the right solution, but again, you have this constitutional layer of complexity. So it'll be interesting to see what solutions they come up with.
Yeah. Hey, this has been a good chat. Appreciate you taking the time to talk with me about it. If anybody's looking for a lawyer in Windsor, Essex County or Southwestern Ontario, I know you guys have clients all over the province, really. Sebastian's been great to work with, and his partner Amy Lynn. They actually just recently sponsored an event for us too, where we had Edge Analytics come out and speak to our office, and it was a great time. So I'm always thankful for that. Appreciate it, Sebastian. And if anyone wants to find out more about you guys or your law firm, best just to go to your website.
Yep, www.msslawyers.ca.
Amazing. Thank you. Really
Thanks
appreciate
very
your
much,
time.
Cody.
Yep. Take care. Bye. Thanks for listening to the show, folks. Please keep in mind that this show is not offering legal, financial, or accounting advice, but rather opinions and experiences in the world of real estate from the host and the guests. If you're enjoying the show, please rate, review, and share with your friends and colleagues. And if you think that there's someone that needs to be on this show, please feel free to connect them with me. Or if there's a topic that should be discussed, feel free to let me know. Thank you so much, and bye for now.